Clay. Is clay a suitable material for making stamp dies? To test the usability of clay as a stamp die material, we tested it in 3 states: wet, leather hard, and then air dried. First of all, with the wet clay, we rolled it into a cylinder, and then the faces were pressed against a flat surface to create a suitable face on which to carve the design. We then began to create the designs onto these faces using needles. This process allowed us to identify issues with using the clay in this form, as we found that it deformed as we tried to engrave into it. As the needle was pressed or cut into the clay, inclusions would form around the edges of the impressions. This was particularly prevalent in the more complex designs. We found that those ones in particular tended to misshape and misform. Once it had been engraved, we then left those dies to dry. We tried using leather hard clay, again making impressions using needles. The clay would deform less, so we found that the design held better than in the wet state. However, the inclusions were much more apparent, as while trying to carve into the leather hard clay, they would push out into the design and therefore deform the design that way, making the overall pattern less crisp. Air dried clay didn't work at all. Needles were once again used, but they were when they were pressed into the clay, fragments of dry clay were flaking off and severely damaging the face of the die and therefore the design on it. Stamping the clay also presented some issues. The clarity of the design impressed by these dies became less clear the more the stamps were used. They didn't deform entirely, but the crispness of the stamp impressions deteriorated the more that it was used. And we also found that, much like with the beeswax, there was a slight suction, though not as dramatic as with the beeswax, causing the impression being left to deform slightly, even more from the original stamp die. Ultimately, we felt that clay wasn't exactly an ideal material, although it was really great for manipulating the more complex designs with.